Good evening and welcome to Nazareth for this important dialogue tonight. My name is Dr. Wayne Hilson, Vice President for Culture, Community, and Belonging, and I want to personally thank our distinguished authors, the Konar Center for Tolerance and Jewish Studies, the Levine Center to End Hate, and the Monroe County Bar Association for challenging our communities to learn, reflect, strategize, and enact our individual and collective agency in the most authentic way possible. As Nazareth closes in on 100 years of existence, we are reminded of the overarching ethos of our Sisters of St. Joseph founders, responding to the needs of the time. I feel we are now called to respond to an increasingly toxic detachment between a shared humanity and the myriad journeys made interesting by our unique ethnic and cultural lineages. To that end, we here at Nazareth envision part of our role as being to prepare our community to be equity-minded, socially just change makers, to model and see modeled the competencies required to connect with the humanity in all of us as we seek to understand, seek to empathize, and seek to cultivate a truly just world. We will sometimes disagree. We will sometimes not accurately see the lived truths of others as they are refracted by our own cultural lenses, and we will sometimes be called to pivot. What we cannot do is allow divisive rhetoric, both external and internal, to our cultural communities to diminish the collective impact born of both struggle and triumph. Let us tonight continue the work. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, this is working. Good evening. Good evening. All right. This is amazing. I have to tell you, this is more than I could have even imagined, all of us that organized this. So thank you all for being here. My name is Karen Elam. I'm Executive Director of the Levine Center to End Hate at the Jewish Federation of Greater Rochester. And I'll just say again, we're delighted to see so many of you here. For the past 4 years, the Levine Center has partnered with the Konar Center for Tolerance and Jewish Studies here at Nazareth College and the Monroe County Bar Association to present a program to the community and to the campus that addresses the uptick in hate that we have been seeing in our country and locally. It has been my great honor to prepare this program tonight with Beth Lilach, if you want to stand, the Executive Director of the Konar Center. Kevin Ryan, who is the Executive Director of the Monroe County Bar Association. Jill Paperno, who is the past president of the Monroe County Bar, and one of our moderators. Langston McFadden, who is current president of the bar, and another moderator. And Jeffrey Wicks, who is a local attorney who has been in the planning with us since the beginning. So I just want to do a quick bit of housekeeping at the start. Please make sure you silence your cell phones. The restrooms are outside the room. For the Q&A portion of tonight's program, you should have index cards at your tables, except that I realize I bought a pack of 100 and there are more than 100 people here. So if you have a question and you don't have an index card, maybe find somebody who doesn't use theirs. We will collect those during the presentation and have Q&A after a brief break. We have several staff, if maybe you can wave in the back. We've got Sapir and Chaz, Biffy, Stephanie, who will be available to run around and collect your index cards. So just hold them up as you think of a question. We are delighted to be bringing you tonight's program called Bridging the Black-Jewish Divide, a Dialogue. At a time when white supremacy is on the rise, hate speech has become normalized, and hate crimes against blacks and Jews have reached an all-time high, we're reminded of the importance of unity in the face of hate. Yet, the complex relationship that African Americans and Jewish Americans have demonstrates the challenges that can stand in the way of a meaningful collaboration. So tonight's program will allow us to dig into the history of Black and white Jewish relations and explore ways that we can move forward together. And now it is my great honor and privilege to hand over the moderation to Jill Paperno and Langston McFadden.
Good evening. It's great to see all of you here tonight. I want to thank you for coming on my behalf and on behalf of all of the committee that put this together, as well as the authors. So I also have a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, I want to tell you how the evening is going to go. Initially, Professors Berlinblau and Johnson are going to introduce the subject and speak a little bit. There are going to be some film clips. And then we're going to be asking them questions, Langston and I. After that, you're going to be sharing your questions with us, and the authors will be taking questions from you. I also want to let you know that there are books for sale in the back of the room. They're $20 each, and the professors will be signing books at the end of this program if you'd like to get their signatures. The sales can be made by check, cash, or credit card. And for the CLE credit, for the attorneys in the crowd, attorneys seeking CLE credit must return their evaluations before we can issue credit. CLE rules require that you must be present for the entire program to receive credit. No partial credit can be awarded. Attendance certificates will be sent to you by email after we have received your evaluations. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers, Dr. Terrence Johnson and Dr. Jacques Berlinblau. They're over here. Do you want to come up? And I am going to share some of their background with you, and so is Langston. Terrence L. Johnson is professor of African American Religious Studies at Harvard Divinity School. He joined Harvard from the Department of Government at Georgetown University, where he was associate professor of religion and politics, a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and an affiliate member of the Department of African American Studies. He also served on the executive committee of the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown. He earned his BA from Morehouse College, Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School, and PhD in Religion from Brown University. He is an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. In his scholarship, he weaves together African American religions, political theory, and American history to paint broad conceptual schemes for imagining religion, democracy, ethics, liberalism, justice, and freedom.
Good evening, everyone. Jacques Berlinblau is a professor of Jewish civilization at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He holds a doctorate in ancient Near Eastern languages and literature from NYU and a doctorate in sociology from the New School of Social Research. He has published 10 books and 35 scholarly articles on a wide variety of subjects with special attention to secularism, religion and politics, Jewish American literature, African American and Jewish American relations, and American higher education. Berlinblau toggles between pure academic writing and more public-facing endeavors in terms of the latter. He has written for, appeared on, or had his work discussed in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Economist, Salon, The Guardian, The New Republic, The Nation, NPR, Tablet, Commentary, The Forward, the Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, Canadian Broadcast Network, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Al Jazeera, Times Higher Education, The Daily Beast, New York Magazine, PBS, MSNBC, CBS, CBC, TF1, AFP, and CNN, and now I need a break. We're going to start tonight's program soon, and we're going to start with a couple of brief clips provided by our speakers. But before we begin, I'd like to set the tone for tonight's discussion. Okay? Tonight's topic can elicit strong feelings and strong emotional reactions from all of us. Okay? We're going to ask that each one of us be patient, be understanding, understand that each one of us comes to this discussion with different life views and different life experiences and expectations. Okay? We're going to ask that we all be respectful and mindful of those thoughts, and let's have a wonderful, enlightened evening where we respect one another, and hopefully we walk away learning something about each other that we did not know before this evening started. Okay. Now, with that being said, let's begin this wonderful journey together as Terrence and Jacques takes us through the video clips.
begin with the Maya Angelou piece.
Yes.
And I'll just sort of set it up in terms of, we wanted to sort of like bring you in to what the voice called sort of life behind the veil of ignorance, or the veil. That's not wrong, someone else. Life behind the veil. And in some ways, Dr. Angelou really speaks to the kind of the doubleness of black life and the ways in which language is used both to describe but also to create a kind of performative element as a way to reveal not only like the cultures but also the dynamism in the kind of language. And so often when you see the so-called other, the so-called black, right, we have varying kinds of stereotypes. But I think this clip sets up, I think, a new way of thinking about what we historically call black experiences, but really she gives us insight into what it means to be what Du Bois called the Negro problem, and then how the Negro problem, right, both responds but also creates, right, many different worlds that often we don't see, because we only see the criminalization on television. We only see their responses to injustice. But here, Angela is trying to really show the kind of the joy that is linked to pain, but also the kind of the creation, right, of life within the veil. So let's start it off, please.
Have written a poem for a woman who rides a bus in New York City.
And here she's bringing together the poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, We Wear the Mask, and her own creation of black women's response to the mask.
Made. She has two shoes.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No. But I like to say more as we're waiting, because I think what's really what we're trying to do is to show sort of the complicated ways both blacks and white Jews have attempted to navigate, right, this landscape we call America, right? A very complicated landscape, right, where there are rights, there are opportunities, and yet there's so many barriers, right? Barriers that are very evident, but also barriers that are seeped within the culture. Do you want to set up your video while we're waiting?
Sure. While we're waiting, hello everybody. On behalf of Professor Johnson and myself, we say hello Rochester. Nice to meet you all. We want to thank the Konar Center. We want to thank the Levine Institute, and of course we want to thank the Monroe County Bar Association for inviting us. The clip I'm going to set up comes from Woody Allen. All right, so there's some issues there, but in terms of American Judaism, it's really interesting. It's probably the single greatest thing he's ever said or done about Judaism, and it comes from the movie Zelig, and it speaks to what I feel is an unspoken fear, some might even call it a pathology, within the American Jewish community, the white American Jewish community, vis-a-vis their identity. So we'll let Woody Allen carry that for us, a very, very painful discussion for American Jews, and I think we may be ready for the great Maya Angelou.
Yeah, no.
So I
No,
have a-
and in many respects, you know, we deal with technology issues all the time in the classroom, so this is like not a big deal. But we try to bring in sort of multimedia as a way to really kind of give a kind of flesh to all the sort of the theory we're dealing with. And we find it's a way to kind of open up the conversation, right?
Right, so we taught a class together at Georgetown for 5 years called Blacks and Jews in America, and that's how we met, and that's how we developed this relationship, and that's how we started researching together for the book that we recently published.
And while we're waiting, I think this is actually a live version of You're on Mute, right?
Yes.
But I do have a question for you based on something that Terrence just said. You had mentioned something about, I think it was Terrence, white Jews, and you make a distinction in the book about Jews and white Jews. And while we're waiting, did you want to address that to kind of set the table for the evening?
Yeah, sure. So basically, we really wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that Judaism is very multicultural, right? It's not simply sort of white Jews that we see in America, but when I went to Tel Aviv for the first time, I was telling Jacques, I was like, wow, I saw such a diverse group of people, right, who came from all over the world. And Jacques was like, no, this is what the Jewry looks like. And often in America, right, that gets diminished, but we're discovering now, we've talked to like more than a dozen Jewish federations, and now the big issue
across the country is how do we deal internally with our own issues of race and racism? So I think that's something to be applauded, and they're really struggling to sort of make sense of the fact that there is a diverse Jewish community that often gets left out when we talk about Judaism in America.
And I'll add something, but first, Maya Angelou. We ready?
A poem for a woman who rides a bus in New York City. She's a maid. She has 2 shopping bags. When the bus stops abruptly, she laughs. If the bus stops slowly, she laughs. If the bus picks up someone, she laughs. If the bus misses someone, she... So I watched her for about 9 months. I thought, Now, if you don't know black features, you may think she's laughing. But she wasn't laughing. She was simply extending her lips and making a sound. I said, oh, I see. That's that survival apparatus. Now, let me write about that to honor this woman who helps us to survive. By her very survival, Miss Rosie, through your destruction I stand up. So I used the poem with Mr. Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, Masks, and my own poem for old black men. Mr. Dunbar wrote Masks in 1892. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It shades our cheeks and hides our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts, we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but oh my God, our tears to thee from tortured souls arise. And we sing, hey, baby, we sing, hey, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet and long the mile. But let the world think otherwise. We wear the mask. When I think about myself, I almost laugh myself to death. My life has been one great big joke, a dance that's walked, a song was spoke. I laugh so hard, I almost choke when I think about myself. 70 years in these folks' world. The child I works for calls me girl. I say, yes, ma'am, for working's sake. I'm too proud to bend and too poor to break. So I laugh until my stomach ache when I think about myself. My folks can make me split my side. I laugh so hard, I nearly died. The tales they tell sound just like lying. They grow the fruit, but eat the rind. I laugh until I start to cry when I think about myself and my folks and the little children. My fathers sit on benches. Their flesh count every plank. The slats leave dents of darkness deep in their withered flank, and they nod like broken candles, all waxed and burnt profound. They say, but sugar, it was our submission that made your world go round. There in those pleated faces I see the auction block, the chains and slavery's coffles, the whip and lash and stock. My father speaking voices that shred my fact and sound. They say, but sugar, it was our submission, and that made your world go round. They laughed to shield their crying. They shuffled through their dreams. They stepped and fetched a country and wrote the blues in screams. I understand their meaning. It could and did derive from living on the ledge of death. They kept my race alive by wearing the mask.
There is no advantage in getting older. You know, I'm 74 now. You don't get smarter, you don't get wiser, you don't get more mellow, you don't get more kindly. Nothing good happens. It's a bad business getting old. And I would advise you not to do it if you can avoid it.
I did the film in England because in the United States, I've been making films for decades, and it's become increasingly more difficult to, I can get financing, but it's become more and more prevalent in the
So
United
this
States.
is all very
for the
fascinating.
studios
Unfortunately,
and
it's the
people
wrong
that give
clip. So we hope you're enjoying it.
To want to participate in the project.
Okay.
They don't want to be thought of just as a bank. They want to.
I mean, yeah, it was pleasant. So I'm just going to come over. So it's Woody Allen Zelig.
When you and the team are pitching a new product, Grammarly's tone suggestions can offer a more personal.
There we go.
Who was this Leonard Zelig that seemed to create such diverse impressions everywhere? All that was known of him was that he was the son of a Yiddish actor named Morris Zelig. As Puck in the Orthodox version of A Midsummer Night's Dream was coolly received. The elder Zelig's second marriage is marked by constant, violent quarreling. So much so that although the family lives over a bowling alley, it is the bowling alley that complains of noise. As a boy, Leonard is frequently bullied by anti-Semites. His parents, who never take his part and blame him for everything, side with the anti-Semites. They punish him often by locking him in a dark closet. When they are really angry, they get into the closet with him. On his deathbed, Morris Zelig tells his son that life is a meaningless nightmare of suffering, and the only advice he gives him is to save string. Though Brother Jack has a nervous breakdown, and Sister Ruth becomes a shoplifter and alcoholic, Leonard Zelig appears to have adjusted to life. Somehow, he seems to have coped. And then, suddenly, increasingly strange behavior. Fascinated by the Zelig phenomenon, Dr. Fletcher arranges a series of experiments and invites the skeptical staff to observe. With the doctors watching, Zelig becomes a perfect psychiatrist. When two Frenchmen are brought in, Zelig assumes their characters and speaks reasonable French. In the company of a Chinese person, he begins to develop Oriental features. By now, word has gotten out to the press, and the public, thirsting for thrills and novelty, is immediately captivated. The clamor is so great that Dr. Alan Sindel is forced to issue a statement.
We're just beginning to realize the dimensions of what could be the scientific medical phenomenon of the age and possibly of all time.
Fresh stories roll off the press every day about Zelig and his puzzling condition. The doctors claim to have the situation in hand. No two can agree on a diagnosis.
I'm convinced that it's glandular in nature, and although there's no evidence now of any misfunction, I'm sure that further tests will show a problem in the secretions.
I'm certain it's something he picked up from eating Mexican food.
This manifestation is neurological in origin. Now, this patient is suffering from brain tumor, and I should not be surprised if within several weeks he died. Now, we have not as yet been able to locate the tumor, but we're still looking.
Ironically, within 2 weeks' time, it is Dr. Bersky himself who dies of a brain tumor. Leonard Zelig is fine. Throughout the weeks of testing and speculation, Eudora Fletcher begins to feel that the patient might be suffering not from a physiological disorder, but from a psychological one. It is Zelig's unstable makeup, she suggests, that accounts for his metamorphoses. The governing board of doctors is hostile to her notion. They conclude that Zelig's malady can be traced to poor alignment of the vertebrae. Tests prove them wrong and cause a temporary problem for the patient. Now the press and public hang on every bit of news, thoroughly absorbed in the real-life drama.
The continuing saga of the strange creature at Manhattan Hospital goes on. This morning, doctors report, experiments were conducted and several women of varying types were placed in close proximity to the subject, but no change occurred, leading authorities to conclude that the phenomenon does not occur with women. Later today, doctors will be experimenting with a midget and a chicken.
Leonard Zelig continues to astound scientists at New York's Manhattan Hospital, where numerous tests have led nowhere in determining the nature of this astonishing manifestation. He is confronted by two overweight men at the request of the doctors. As the men discuss their obesity, an initially reticent Zelig joins in, swelling himself to a miraculous 250 pounds. Next, in the presence of two Negro men, Zelig rapidly becomes one himself. What will they think of next? Meanwhile, Americans all over have their own reactions.
I wish I could be Lenny Zilrich, the changing man, and be different people, and maybe someday my wishes will come true.
Leonard Zilrich is one of the finest gentlemen in the United States of America. He is the cat's pajamas.
Trying a new approach, Dr. Fletcher places the subject under hypnosis.
Now, tell me why you assume the characteristics of the person you're with.
Safe.
What do you mean? What do you mean, safe?
Safe. To be like the others.
You want to be safe?
I want to be liked.
Talking with Woody Allen, we were sort of segueing into.
So just a brief recap. So it's interesting with Maya Angelou, this whole idea of wanting to show the black, right, as a human, someone who suffers from normal anguish, right, frustration, wearing a mask, dealing with, normal day-to-day activities, and then linking that then to the historical reality of racism and gender bias in this country. So a really kind of complicated way to talk with the ways in which people use language, right, in multiple ways. And so unless you know the cultural cues, you don't quite know often what's happening. So often what's presented in front of you is literally only, right, a glimpse of sort of the cultural production behind the creation of this woman, but also, she would say, of the community writ large.
And so if we're looking at masking, we have this famous Zelig clip where I hope you all noticed he's in a pose which is very, very similar to a Nazi salute. And the therapist asks him, why are you doing this? And he says, safe, safe, I want to be liked. There's a famous scene at the end of the movie where they took archival footage of an actual Nazi rally with Adolf Hitler, and they superimposed the Zelig character walking onto stage and sort of kibitzing with the Nazi higher-ups on the stage. The implication being, and I think this was Alan's critique, that there's something about Judaism's ability to meld in, to blend in, which is both exhilarating, fascinating, and maybe in the context of the conversation we're about to have, problematic.
And are you surprised, though, Jacques, that there is this sort of tension in terms of there's a doubleness and a desire to articulate the doubleness, say, for Maya Angelou, and to wrestle with the angst of the two-ness, right, and to articulate that, and yet, do you see the doubleness actually grappled with in Jewish literature?
Absolutely. I think our interlocutors are going to get to us in a second, but this question of doubleness, of dual identities, of pretending to be something you're not for various reasons is clearly something we'll come up with in a moment.
Okay, so, professors, today you're tackling a topic it's big, it's complex, it's multifaceted. It leads to a lot of Okay, that was just a test run. Okay. So today you're tackling a topic that's big, it's multifaceted, it's complex, leads to a lot of emotional and visceral reactions. If you could point out one or two things as your main goal or goals in tackling this topic, what would you want your audience or our audience today to take away from today's discussion?
Sure. I'm most interested in the public having a better understanding of the link between sort of anti-Semitism, anti-black racism, I argue that given the role of religion in this country, that if you think about the issues that are most divisive, it's religion and race. If you think about the ways in which we have maintained segregation, right, and racial oppression, it's around linking religion, right, linking moral claims to beliefs about social creations around race and identity. And what I find very fascinating as I've examined both African American and white Jewish history in late 20th century America is that black folk are hated because they are considered non-human, right? They're without a soul. Jewish Americans are hated because there's something tainted about their flesh, right? There's something about their blood that makes them sort of the antithesis of humanity. And I think the interesting combination, right, is worth exploring, but also worth a conversation around what are the political consequences of that kind of mutual hatred? And how do the groups in varying ways adjust culturally to that mutual hatred? And I think in part because we don't talk about it in public spaces, right, it then festers and grows and creates all kind of animosities, right, and creates a kind of binary that I think is falsely created.
And for me, it's very simple. These are complicated communities, and we sort of level it down when we call it blacks and Jews. There is no one African-American identity. There is no one Jewish-American identity. And their relations with one another do not follow one path or one type of trajectory. So we're professors. We're always calling for a recognition of complexity, but complexity doesn't obviate or nullify analysis. There are still recurring sociological patterns, which we've noticed in our research, which we'd like to bring to your attention today.
In Charlottesville, the main one, right? This idea in 2016, the notion of blacks and Jews will not replace us. A huge marker and a huge wake-up call, and yet there was very little attention in national media about this notion of why are 20-year-olds thinking about blacks and Jews as the central problem facing America.
Together. Why they came immediately after one another in those chants.
So you just mentioned recurring sociological problems, and do you have a kind of summary or list of the ones that come to you first when you're thinking about these recurring problems?
In terms of their interactions with one another. You want to take it? Well, so when we go around the country and we do these conversations, something that keeps coming up is real estate. And you will notice that there are certain historical patterns in African American, so let's non-Jewish African American and white Jewish American encounters. And it goes like this. Typically, there would be in 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940, a Jewish American neighborhood, white Jewish American neighborhood. The Great Migration is taking place as African Americans are fleeing the iron furnace of the South. They come up north, and for reasons that are extraordinarily complicated, the two communities come together in urban spaces. In Baltimore, in Philadelphia, all over New York, in Chicago, in Boston, in Rochester. And this is really where the story, one of the early chapters of the story is that patterned interaction, and I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, which is asymmetrical in terms of power. So you have one group which is slightly more financially on its feet and significantly less despised, though it is despised, that would be white Jewish Americans, than their African American brothers and sisters who are being kind of pushed forward from the South into these neighborhoods. That's ground zero of this relationship, and that's where all this great stuff and all of this not so great stuff happens. But that's why the relationship is so unique, because of real estate and physical proximity. Sure.
And also the mutual interest in the early 1900s, right, to end segregation, right? And so with the formation of the NAACP, we see a multiracial coalition of blacks and Jews in particular who found an organization to deal with issues of the limits of political rights in this country for both groups. And so there's a mutual interest that's strategic around how do we begin to break down barriers. And we try to argue, along with our colleague Adolph Reed, that it's not a natural relationship, but it's a very strategic relationship around rights, right, and around thinking about what does it mean to live in a public that's segregated in which we both face these barriers.
That's actually leads us to a perfect kind of segue into diving deeper into that issue. When you talk about the Great Migration and the two communities kind of ending up in urban areas together, along comes redlining and specific things put in place where African Americans are shuttled and shunned into one area, but the perception is that white Jews were allowed to move out and abroad and expand. How do you address the issue and the division that created between the two groups?
No, I mean, it's a huge sort of, marker in history, right? And Ta-Nehisi Coates really made this popular, right, in terms of this notion that with the New Deal in the mid-1900s, 1930s, right, we have this notion of, whites and white Jews were able to receive, mortgage assistance, right, and blacks were not. And so that was a huge divider, because how do groups in this country gain wealth? Often through home ownership. And so with that huge blockage, then creates all kinds of issues. And again, initially, blacks are moving to Great Migration, moving to the north, thinking more technology, more access to jobs, and again, facing new kinds of barriers. And so this creates a huge, huge stumbling block that has been largely under-discussed until the last, say, 15 years.
And it accounts for the operatic nature of African-American, Jewish-American relations. They're really close. And I always point this out. They were close in ways that no other two groups in the United States were close, which I find fascinating, and I don't have a good answer as to why that is, right? For a good 40, 50 years, African Americans and Jewish Americans, especially in the Northeast, but we could go up to Detroit, Chicago, we could go to the Midwest, eventually California to a lesser, are just next to one another. So here's something pretty that emerges from all of that. Typically, the African American church in your neighborhood might have once been a synagogue, right? The sacred space has remained. I grew up in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and my synagogue became a beautiful, I believe, AME church. That's a very nice thing. Then there's some not nice encounters, right? I'd imagine we might have many white Jewish Americans in this room who will say, my grandfather owned a pharmacy in such and such neighborhood. And after the civil unrest of the 1960s, the entire neighborhood was burnt out, to which an African American would say, well, there are very, very good reasons why that occurred and why there was such rage and anger in the community towards the powers that be that led to an immolation of the community itself. So these are the types of stories that we hear a lot.
And also what's interesting, as these narratives are recounted, right, black folk are often arguing against, look, we are frustrated with the very structure that then created sort of white Jewish ownership disproportionately, right, within these inner cities in ways that prevented black ownership. And then we often hear from our well-intentioned, white Jewish counterparts that, look, we had great relationships with individual African Americans. There are a number of African Americans say, look, I know a great doctor who paid my way through school. So individual extraordinary stories, right, that in some ways speak to a real kind of alliance, and yet it was always asymmetrical, right, because it was a handful of very extraordinary white Jews who were very, very helpful to a handful of African Americans. But African Americans say, no, we actually want your help in terms of changing the very structure so that we also can have the opportunity for entrepreneurship. So that created an interesting divide that I think really was brought to light in the late 90s, right, with the whole rise of hip-hop, right, particularly hip-hop in New York City, really exposing some of these contradictions, and also in film.
So you've talked about the distinctions between white Jews and African Americans and the experiences that they've had and perhaps their perceptions of their own experiences. And you teach college students, and you teach a course with college students about this topic. So I'm wondering, what are the methods you use with college students to enable them to discuss these topics, to disagree, but also to bridge divides? And how would you apply those to community groups and even among friends?
I think it's important to understand the sort of the backdrop of the story of the class. So I originally taught it with a couple of colleagues at Haverford College. After two students, a Palestinian student and a Jewish American student, asked me to basically facilitate a reading course on how to think ethically about Israel-Palestine. And they've asked all these other professors, who are like, no way. Of course, I'm a junior professor, and I'm like, oh, sure, I'll do this. And afterwards, I'm like, what am I thinking? And that really grew into a very interesting course. We taught it for a year. And then when I moved to Georgetown, I was thinking, what do I teach that I can, that I know? I taught the course, and within a week, I get an email from some guy saying, hey, why are you teaching blacks and Jews, and let's meet for coffee? And then when we met, it was a really interesting conversation, because look, this is interesting, but I want to join you. Do you mind if I can join you? I'm thinking, if I hear you're a Zionist, I hear like you're like a guy I shouldn't be talking to, so I'm not sure I want to do this. But the conversation was so enriching, right? And I learned so much. I was like, of course we can do this together. And so I think the backdrop is important because even though I was initially hesitant, I think what opened the door was somehow we established a mutual kind of, it wasn't respect, but mutual admiration for our intellect. And what I find missing in these conversations is that I'm not sure we respect each other's intellect in these conversations. Because to me, respect is like very polite. You're at a dinner party. You don't say, make sure you say the right things, and you go home and then you really trash everybody, right? But we actually don't trash each other. I mean, and whatever we have to say, we say it to each other. So I think that's the backdrop to this course. And so when we started teaching, we really do try to teach it like we're jazz musicians. Like, I'm the preacher, but he's not a rabbi. But he'll say he's like the orchestra, the orchestra band leader or something. And so we try to make sure we bring in music. We make sure the class is very flexible because most kids enter the class thinking, oh, I'm going to learn about Black history, or I'm going to learn about white Jewish history. They never imagine that there's an overlap. And that's what I think is so interesting, is that in some ways they are unsettled throughout the entire course. And I don't think we have a public culture that allows us to become unsettled in any situation. We always go to spaces that affirm who we are.
So I would concur with everything that was said. One really important, post-COVID classrooms are different. I don't know if you're noticing it. Yeah. Something has happened. Yeah, COVID happened, right? And the world fell down. And now we haven't taught the course together post-COVID. Pre-COVID, this is typically what happened. We would come to class, and the students would think these were two independent modules, like the Black module and the Jewish module. They had no idea, right? This was about the historical relationship between African Americans and Jewish Americans because they didn't know it existed, right? We like to make a joke that we could create a university of African American, Jewish American. There's so many things to study that we haven't studied yet. There's so much art, there's so much literature, there's so much politics, there's so much diplomacy. There's so much international relations if you want to think about the UN, Israel, Palestine, the role of African nations in that complex triangulation. So this is a huge, absolutely huge subject that we're sort of trying to kind of like with a fire hose feed to these kids. So how do we create a good vibe there? Well, we personally like each other. That's very clear and that's very, very helpful. And I think we're both very curious. In a way, and I hope there are not too many professors, in a way that a lot of professors have stopped being curious. I don't mean to say this against but there are just like a lot of things I don't know and I want to know about, so I'll ask my friend Terrence, and vice versa. So the types of folks you need to have this conversation intellectually have to be people that say, oh, I didn't know that. I'm wrong, my bad. And in addition, I have a question because I've always wondered about this, and curiosity often facilitates really, really good dialogue. So that is something that we've tried to do.
That is excellent for my question. Anyone that knows me knows that I love having difficult conversations. I'm the one that says, ooh, there's a sleeping bear, let me go poke it. Yeah. So, in the last couple of years, the phrase getting comfortable being uncomfortable has become more and more popular. And that speaks to what you were just saying about having these difficult conversations. What are the tips that you would give individuals who are curious about learning something about another culture, religion, any group, that they have preconceived notions or stereotypes that they're not quite sure about? And what is the advice you would give for the person receiving those questions and those inquiries on how to respond without it getting heated and abusive?
Sure. So I would say read and listen. I don't know what it was like. I'm a little older than my colleague. When I went to college, now you went to Morehouse, so it's a little different, right? When I went to college in the 80s at NYU, the whole thing was you wanted to get away from your group, right? So I was a Jewish American, so I joined the Japanese Society. I was curious, right? There were languages. No, but I just wanted to, it was interesting to me. Everything was interesting to me. And then I started studying jazz pretty seriously. And this was something that could be done back in the day. It really wasn't seen. And now there's a sort of freighted tension about that move on American college campuses. And I personally, I don't know if personally, I find it kind of sad that we don't bring that curiosity to our conversations about one another. So I want to throw it to Terrence and ask him what the experience was like at Morehouse in a moment. But in answer to your question, sure, get uncomfortable. The platform is safety, right? People have to feel safe, physically safe. So we thank law enforcement that's here for making us feel physically safe. But with social media, we also have to feel that not everything we're saying is being broadcast to the entire globe, right? And this is changing conversations. This terror we all have that private words, face-to-face interactions are being transmitted everywhere and wrenched out of context. So I would urge people when we have these conversations, do think about physical safety and think about what we might call cyber safety, right? Where are your words going? Can you be sure if you say something dumb, and you will, trust me, I know. If you say something dumb, is it going to end up in Belgium within 2 seconds, right? That is a fear that I often have when I speak. Can you tell us about Morehouse?
Yeah, well, I would add, here's where we differ, right? Because I always tell my students, look, I can't make the classroom safe. I learned a long time ago when I had a trans student in my class and I didn't quite know what was happening, that the trans student did not feel comfortable. And often when I talk to my black colleagues, especially black women, they're like, we don't feel comfortable in a lot of faculty meetings, but you learn how to cope, you learn how to strategize. And what is so frustrating for me in terms of this attack against whatever wokeism is that people assume that African Americans are entering into these spaces wanting people to actually hear their voices. And I would argue that African Americans, through Maya Angelou, have been using double talk since we entered these elite spaces, right? And we have learned to talk in multiple languages in a way that attempts to bring in new knowledge without overshadowing other people. But there's an assumption that somehow these new bodies are threatening and are making certain kinds of demands, when in fact, we have always adjusted, right, and toned things down simply to help sort of change the context. And so Morehouse, loved Morehouse, had an extraordinary time there. And I remember, like, we had to take Shakespeare. I was like, why am I at a black college taking a class on Shakespeare? And the professor was like, she had been in England, whatever. But she used Shakespeare in conversation with Billie Holiday, with jazz music, as the way to talk about the universality of Shakespeare's work around tragedy, but also to bring it to life in black communities. And to me, that is sort of the best part of liberal arts education, where you take so-called universal truths in multiple contexts and you put them in conversation. But the assumption is if you're teaching black studies that somehow you don't know the classics, when in fact, when you read Du Bois, when you read Andrew Cooper, all the greats, they all had to know the classics, right? And Morehouse, we were so frustrated because they're like, no, you have to know the classics, but we're teaching you to be a really good black person within a system. And the irony is that when I went to Harvard Divinity School, it was like, oh, we're teaching you how to rewrite rules. I was like, wow, very different strategy, very different approach, right? And so anyway, I didn't want to go on that tangent, but I don't want our students to feel safe, but I want our students to see through us that we can have an entertaining conversation, not take ourselves too seriously, but also push ourselves. And my fear is that because we become so professionalized, because we as parents, I'm part of the problem as well, we want our kids to like all have straight A's, all have this certain kind of map, that they go to school and they can't be free. Because we're thinking about, okay, this is what mommy and daddy want me to do. They spent all this money to get me here. And yet, and the last thing I'd say is that Morehouse was about, we want to transform you. I'm not sure elite spaces are interested in transforming students, but actually credentializing people. And not to critique any place in particular, but I think it's interesting, right, the way in which education, the direction, and it's not because black folk entered these spaces and made them that way. Right? There's a structural change around technology that you write about all the time in terms of the decline of liberal arts education of this country. So sorry, I didn't mean to go off on that tangent, but I think it's related to blacks and Jews because in many respects, we have been writing about this, right, within the literature, and yet we're often ignored because, again, it's like, oh, you're bringing your identity to the conversation and not bringing intellectual knowledge and new rubrics for thinking about perennial problems.
No, that's good. I see Karen. Oh. If you have questions, please write them down and then put your hand up, and Karen will be picking up the questions. And I was going to ask a follow-up on that, but I just lost my track, so I'm going to go to my notes. In the book, you explore the history of black and Jewish relationships in the United States going back to the years of slavery. But one focus is the period in the early 1900s, and you describe the Grand Alliance. So first, I want to ask you to explain that, but I also want to say that as a Jewish woman, I think I was raised to look back at that period and say, hey, we did this good thing, right? So could you explain what the Grand Alliance is and your perspective on it?
Sure. So the Grand Alliance I mentioned earlier is really around, I would say, between 1900 and probably 1965, where we see, again, a coalition around political rights. Most common one is like the Brown versus Board of Education, even in terms of voting rights, other voting rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 64 or 65, and also many of the advisors, the lawyers helping Martin Luther King Jr. And SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were Jewish Americans. So there was a real sense in which white Jews are very much committed to this idea of thinking about strategically how do we, as a united group, sort of tackle rights in this country. And then also we have the whole idea with Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, Julian Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington creating the Rosenwald schools, about 5,000 schools in the South that were aimed at educating African Americans. And a number of the alumni are now college presidents, sit on major boards, and so it was a really interesting coalition where they both committed 50-50% to building these schools. So it was a really one of the few asymmetrical relationships between blacks and Jews that we've noticed. And I'll let Jacques handle the issue of around slavery and the South, which are very different relationships between blacks and white Jews.
Right, so let's go from 1910 to 1967 very quickly. 1909, 1910 formation of the NAACP, which is a pretty joint venture between white Jewish Americans and non-Jewish African Americans. Will race forward to the period of FDR and liberalism, which we'll talk about in a moment. In the 40s and 50s, the major black organizations and the major Jewish organizations start to work together very, very effectively. The fruits of their labor are the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Act, and Brown versus Board of Ed. These are massive, monumental legal victories. All right. Meanwhile, these communities are living together under the aforementioned asymmetrical relationships of power, and a tremendous amount of art, a tremendous amount of literature, poetry, dance is being generated between them. 1967, for reasons we'll get into in a moment, marks a break. And we refer to the present period as the afterglow period. So, to the Jewish side of things, the white Jewish side of things, I'll say this. White Jewish Americans look back to the period of MLK and the Civil Rights Movement as a sort of Shangri-La, as a moment when we worked together with our non-Jewish African American brothers and sisters, and some Jewish African American brothers and sisters, and we built a civil rights juggernaut, the likes of which the United States had never seen before and probably hasn't seen in its aftermath. We feel very good about it, and we should feel very good about it, except the narrative is more complicated. Right? So what is known as the Grand Alliance is read differently in the African American community than it is in the white Jewish American community. And this is what our book wanted to touch at. We wanted to raise this possibility, especially for white Jewish American audiences, that it was a more freighted and tensile relationship, and it was a relationship which had a lot of self-interest mixed in as well.
But I think the South is really important in terms of the conflict.
Antebellum.
Yes.
Right. So you want to get back to the 19th century, or should we say in the 20th century?
Let's explore this discussion a little bit further, because this is actually kind of perfect. As the official bear poker in the room, there are people who say the Grand Alliance was really more about pragmatism rather than sharing of a common history. What are your thoughts on that aspect of it?
I think it's both and. On the one hand, we see Rabbi Heschel reading about King and saying, wow, there's something here in the sorrow songs, in the use of Egypt, right, in persecution that I recall from my lineage, right? And there's something about the ways in which he heard King and the movement speak to him that spoke to Judaism and allowed him, felt compelled to want to meet this guy. And so I do think there's something around the varying uses of the Hebrew Bible within both communities that connected folk. But I also think it was also pragmatic in terms of the legal strategy, right? Because these are mostly elite men, right, who were leading this movement. for very pragmatic reasons, which is why I think in 67, when there's a fallout, the pragmatism shows its face because there's a lot of frustration, particularly among the men. And someone like Stokely Carmichael saying, well, wait a minute. You guys are advancing, quote unquote, in ways that we're not. You're slowly moving to the suburbs. And now we have this thing called Israel-Palestine erupting. Carmichael is engaged in Jewish literature, lived in New York City, hung out with a lot of leftist Jews, right, in the Village, goes to Howard University, continues to read about Zionism, is a supporter of Zionism, and then war breaks out. He's like, oh, wait a minute. I think I'm going to rethink this based on how I'm interpreting the acts that are happening in Israel at this moment. And again, I think part of it has everything to do with the question of a homeland, right? And this whole notion that we are working as a unit pragmatically, and then, but pragmatically, Stokely is saying, I don't see the same kinds of fruits or dividends in terms of African-American success versus perceived white Jewish success.
It was a pragmatic relationship. What's weird, though, is a lot of Jewish Americans and African Americans just dug one another. I don't know how else to, I mean, not a lot, a small percentage, but these were the only two groups where this was consistently happening. So there's a term that we use in the literature, civil rights babies, right? I mean, you can figure it out, right? Civil rights babies are the children of folks who met in the civil rights movement, loved one another, and God bless, and had all of these beautiful children. So there are two things happening. There's a really pragmatic edge to the Grand Alliance. Both communities can get something out of this. And I've often heard it said, well, the African-American community got a lot more out of it. Think again. Look at the formation of the State of Israel, and look at the UN votes, and look at why a few African countries and Haiti voted for, and read histories of diplomacy, and you'll understand that both these groups needed one another to achieve various group objectives. So that's the pragmatic side. They had interests, right? Then there's this weird thing, which I'm not ready to let go of yet, Professor Johnson, right? That some members, maybe 2%, 3%, just really liked one. I don't know what it is, right? Something cultural or something reminded them of one another, but we do find these encounters between African Americans and white Jewish, which are just very intense and very emotional, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think that's an actuarial table speaking. There's some affinity there. We haven't found it yet, and I'm very interested in that because I personally felt it in my life, and I want to know more about it and why it's there. And I don't want to desecrate it. I don't want to make it seem as an act of appropriation or apologetics. I think there's something special about it.
But then with 67, we see the problem of whiteness and liberalism, right? The whole debate around, Snick is saying, are white Jews willing to challenge the very structures, right, of capitalism, right, of individuality, as sort of the sources of black suffering, right, and for the reproduction of black suffering, black unemployment, and so forth.
So now we need a redirect, because I guess we're going to speak about whiteness and Judaism. I'm imagining.
I wasn't sure if we were going there or to liberalism. So,
right, well, very closely related.
So there is a discussion of liberalism within the book, and my understanding is you have different perspectives on it. So I'm wondering if you could each define what you take to liberalism to mean and share your perspectives on it.
Sure. Very, very succinctly, so I see liberalism in terms of the John Rawls tradition, right, considered sort of the father of Anglo-American political philosophy, and the whole notion that the goal of a democratic society that believes in pluralism, right, is to focus on political justice and to keep your, quote, deep commitments, what he called comprehensive commitments, to the side, out of the public conversation. And so I interpret that as saying, look, Rawls wants a voting rights, primarily legislation, right, and an agenda. And liberalism promotes this whole notion that through voting rights, right, through this idea of voting for people into office, through legislation, and also through equal opportunity for economic success, that we can actually achieve so-called equality. But what I've argued is that liberalism has not taken into account the degree to which these comprehensive beliefs, right, seek into our political behavior, right, and then create the norms for beliefs around black criminality, right? This whole idea that when we have a criminal, it happens to be African American, it's not simply an individual, but it is actually the group. Whereas if there's a white mass shooter, it's like, oh my God, this guy who's completely insane, but he's not assigned to the group. It's not like all white men are massive shooters. They're not demonized in the same way. So liberalism did not take into account, right, that very potent kind of reality. And so I believe that part of the issue with the civil rights movement, which I'm very thankful for obvious reasons, right, in some ways failed because we linked human dignity to voting rights. And I always argue, what would happen if they took away the rights again? And clearly we're at a moment where there's clear efforts, right, to minimize voting. And so I've always argued that we have to have human dignity in ways that surpass whatever happens in the state, right? If we are sent back into enslavement, we have to define human dignity for ourselves, and it can't be linked to any political action, because it means the state is always in control.
I'm a liberal. I'm an old school liberal. If I were to define liberalism for this group, I would say it is a discourse that is rights-based, highly individual, deeply suspicious of church-state meddling, and we know how important the African-American church is in Black America, so I want you to think of a kind of a collision there, right? But Professor Johnson had me read Charles Mills's work, who is a political philosopher, a late political philosopher, who made a very compelling argument that the founders of liberalism, be it Immanuel Kant, be it John Locke, did not like persons of African ancestry. And the argument is that baked into the cake of liberalism is racism. And to me, that is a very compelling argument, and it's something I have to work through in my own thinking of liberalism, right? So liberalism, which sets up this idea of equality, of individuals, of rights-based, of the consent of the governed, the importance of the majority, is tinctured or permeated by this hatred of persons of African ancestry and others. Now, this is not my opinion per se, but it's something I'm thinking about a lot, because as a professor I can do that, right? I'm not a politician, I'm a professor, and I think the logic is compelling. So let's get to blacks and Jews, right? 1967, Stokely Carmichael, right, who spoke Yiddish, who grew up with Jews, who, if I'm not mistaken, was in a Jewish fraternity. We see these stories a lot.
Yes.
Stokely Carmichael, in a sort of shot to the liberal African-American civil rights leadership, just goes off on Israel. And it's the 1967 Six-Day War. Israel has won. Stokely makes it very, very clear that he views Israel as a white colonialist settler state that is taking rights away from Palestinians who he equates with African Americans. This is where the relationship blows up, but it's also the moment in African American history, and it was a long time coming, right, where the old liberal Christian guard finds itself challenged, am I getting this right, by a younger, more radical, anti-liberal black movement, which would eventually turn into, let's say, Black Panthers, and more radical movement. So for us, that is where liberalism features into all of this. Did I get this right?
You did. And one other point, what's interesting, and people fail to realize, is that particularly as a woman of Ethel Minor, who's not really well known, but she forces, particularly Carmichael, to really think globally. And so around 67, African Americans are engaging South African writers. They're communicating with folks there and really trying to say, look, we can't achieve justice in the U.S., and so we need to think about justice globally in terms of what we used to call a third world alliance. And so they were thinking through, how do we actually form forces with former colonized African countries, right, and also with helping the apartheid movement. And so as they were engaging the apartheid movement, then the whole question of Israel's relationship, right, as you say, with justifiable, as you say, with South Africa becomes a huge point, saying how can you have an alliance with this country given its history and treatment of African Americans? And so all of that just implodes in their faces, and here we are.
And this is why the Grand Alliance collapses. And we're 50 years out now, 60 years out, and Professor Johnson and I are trying to pick up the pieces and better understand where the relationship might go and what the future might be. But 1967 is a watershed.
And to get into, kind of the meat of that conversation, kind of touched on Israel, and that tends to be that third rail discussion where when blacks and Jews are having discussions, it kind of gets heated. It becomes, a comparison of, a belief that white Jews were given land when Israel was formed, and what happened to the quote-unquote 40 acres and a mule for black people. And we get into these generalizations and these discussions, and then it becomes a comparison of atrocities. And how do we move past that? If black people talk about slavery, Jewish people talk about the Holocaust. If black people talk about racism, Jewish people talk about anti-Semitism. And all of those things are atrocious. And there's not a measure that says one is worse than the other, but that's where the conversation seems to devolve and people stop listening to one another and start talking at one another. So how do you address that issue and those difficult conversations?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot there on the table you just raised. I mean, I would say that the Israel piece, right, particularly for the SNCC members, really emerges from, I think, what Jacques mentioned earlier in terms of this kind of strange relationship between the two groups. And I do think that for many African Americans, this idea of Jews as a chosen people rings loud. And so there's a certain expectation when you look at some of the archival work where they're saying, we expect something different in part because of Judaism. And I would say we hear white Jews saying the very same thing by African Americans, like, no, we have been there. We have been supported financially, right? We do expect something in return. And that's what happens in political solidarity. So I do think that Israel is unique in part because of the question around, do you have a special role in this world as a Jewish person? And I also say that in terms of the Olympics over oppression, it really emerges, I think, again, from this whole notion that America has been unwilling to acknowledge, right, its hand in denying Jewish Holocaust or potential Jewish Holocaust survivors entry into this country, right? This idea that Hitler uses segregation and racial scientific racism coming out of the US as part of his whole crazy imagination about the Jewish people, right, comes out of the US. And so when we think about the Holocaust in America, right, according to Michael Staub, many of the initial white Jewish immigrants didn't want to talk about it. It was like, and obviously in the 1930s and 40s, didn't want to talk about it. And so with the emergence of the Holocaust Museum, right, we see a book come out called Beloved. And some Jews accused Toni Morrison of saying, you are trying to make African enslavement similar as if not more horrific than a Holocaust. And this creates a kind of public exchange, which is really a kind of scholarly debate in terms of how do we account for trauma, and then people then begin to say, oh yes, now there's a fight between blacks and white Jews, and especially the opening says something like 60 million more.
For the 60 million.
For the 60 million in terms of the dedication of the book. And so this idea of wanting to look at African enslavement, right, in a way that spoke through the voices of those who were enslaved, right, people viewed Morrison as attempting to then trump the Holocaust.
So we have these conversations a lot, and what happens is when non-Jewish African-American folks and white Jewish Americans start speaking, we should talk about Afro-Jews in a moment. They're really polite at first, really, really, really polite. That movie that just came out, which I reviewed, which I didn't like, You People, there were a lot of African-American commenters that were like, no black person I know would ever be so rude, right? And I was like, exactly, right? That's not the way most African-Americans speak to anyone. It's just politeness in the community, right? So the first stage of a black Jewish, in quotes, conversation is politeness, right? And that's great. I applaud politeness. The second stage is pain. And the pain is so visceral and so raw as people start speaking to one another. We saw this in particular in Baltimore, all right? That's where we saw it, where we really broke down the tables. Everybody was at a table like you across 3 weeks, and people were forced to speak with one another. So I don't really know what to do with all that pain other than to say it's completely legitimate, and maybe we shouldn't hierarchize it or try to understand whose pain is worse, but there should be kind of an open listening of one another's pain. I understand that many we talked about the Holocaust Museum, right? The Holocaust Museum was authorized by Congress in 1979. That was an atrocity that took place on foreign soil. Professor Johnson, refresh my memory, when did the African American Museum receive approval from Congress? It's strange, is it not? And this is not either or, because as a white, nominally Jewish American, I'm like, what's up with that? I'm really happy there's a Holocaust Museum, right? There should be one, right? I don't understand why 30 years after, only 30 years after, we get the African American Museum that we need and we deserve as American citizens. So these are really hard conversations. And my warning is to those who want to have them, be prepared for pain. Because the amount of pain in the typical Jewish American and the typical African American is bottomless, justifiably, and it's there.
So it sounds like when you're talking about this subject in particular, there's an intellectual piece in looking at the history and perhaps, our knowledge of our ancestors, and then there's this emotional piece. And I was going to ask you, do you have a way of sorting out how to have those conversations, recognizing that there's this intellectual and that there's an emotional piece? But what you're saying now, I'm not sure what you're saying, whether you do have some answers to that or how you would handle that in these conversations.
It depends on the context. Clearly, if I'm in a synagogue or a church, I'll handle it very differently. And I'll just be very open and frank with you guys. I mean, teaching this course within an elite institution, I resisted the idea of dealing with sort of trauma and quote-unquote emotion, in part because there's always this assumption that when you're teaching Black studies, that it's always about making people feel good. So we really wanted to make sure that it was quote-unquote rigorous, wherever the heck that means, right? And so, but in part because I haven't been given authority to actually come in as a pastoral care counselor, I didn't feel it was fair to the students to try to counsel in that way. But we definitely tried to provide texts that would give them avenues if they were thinking about how to actually deal with my own trauma. Like, we definitely provided resources, but we're very clear. We wanted people to see make historical connections so that when they argue with people, it was about, we have real data, right? We have anecdotes, we have narratives, we have citations, right, to justify these competing kinds of claims. And at some point, we have been sort of wrestling with how to deal with the trauma, but then COVID happened.
You're absolutely right, Professor Johnson. It's context. A classroom, I don't think, is a great pain space, at least not for the type of soft social science that we do. I don't think we're not trained in...
Well, I am.
You are trained. You are trained?
I took CPE. Yeah, it's clinical pastoral education. Yes,
I did not know that.
But I don't use it at Georgetown. I didn't use it at Georgetown.
Negatively trained in that, right? I didn't know. So classrooms generally, I don't think, are great spaces for the exploration of pain, but I'm sure I have some colleagues here that are like, no, you're very wrong. So I all respect to them. Churches and synagogues, which is where we do some of our ACE work, the two of us, those are really nice, safe spaces, I find, to speak. Why? Because you're in church. I mean, everybody's cool in church, right? Professor Johnson always likes to tell the white students at Georgetown that, how do you say, in an African-American church, you'd be surprised how anything can be said, right? Anything can be said. Because there's a trusting community there. Synagogues, we've had great conversations in synagogues. Community groups. All right, that's where things get very interesting. What was interesting about Baltimore is we had what a friend of mine calls solid people there, right? Community organizers, right? Folks who worked for the AJC and the NAACP, right? And they were psychologists who had worked in the community, people who work on food insecurity. That was a very interesting conversation because it was professional knowledge on the floor, right? The floor being here. People who deal with these problems on a very granular basis. So all I can tell you, I have no answer to your very good question, Langston, but I think, and Jill, I think that the context is crucial, right? What kind of space are you in, just as Terrence said, and then you have to make some decisions about politeness and pain, and do not underestimate the role that pain plays in these two communities, right? Pain is like ubiquitous in these communities. I'm sure there are other communities as well. This is the United States, after all, right? There are other communities. But these communities in particular, with their very, very strong, shall we say, literary and verbal skills, right, who know how to narrativize their pain, it's there. It's just ready to pop out.
And in Baltimore, we actually, because of the nature of the group, we said, look, particularly with, say, some of the Jewish organizations, have you ever considered having, say, the president of Morgan State on your board, right? I mean, are there any black folk you're engaging in a real meaningful way where it's not only about trust, but it's about expectations, about mutuality, right? Often it's this notion where, we have great, wonderful Jewish philanthropists on historically black colleges' boards. They're wonderful, and yet I'm not sure the expectation is that black folk will give to Jewish organizations. Why not? It may not be the same at the same level, but in other words, is there expectation that that knowledge from black bodies can have the same kind of influence in a Jewish organization?
I'm going to not ask a question now because we are running out of time for our questions, but I just want to observe that sometimes I think in conversations we feel like we have to convince the other person of the rightness of our position and have them come around to that. And one of the things that I'm observing as you're speaking tonight is there are many things you disagree on, and you tour the country disagreeing about things, and that's okay. I'm going to turn it over to Langston now because we're going to get into the audience questions since we're running a little late.
So this really is about you and giving you an opportunity to learn and to interact with and ask your questions to the two professors. And the first question, I absolutely love it because it's a difficult question, but it's a respectful question. And I think that's what we need to do here, be unafraid to ask those difficult questions and to listen to what is said in response. So the first question is, why only talk about white Jews? What about Middle Eastern and African Jews and African American Jews? Where do Jews of color fit into your discourse?
Huge in our discourse, right? I did mention I want to get to this, I want to get to this, I want to get to this. So Terrence always tells this story when he goes to Israel, the Holy Land. He's like, whoa, it doesn't look like the Jewish population of New York, right? It kind of looks not white. Now, so the majority of world Judaism is not white, and that's really, really important to understand, right? Because of the vicissitudes of history, the Jewish population that you see in the United States, God bless them, is mostly the descendants of Ashkenazi Jews. So phenotypically, at least to our eyes now, they look white. They didn't look white 80 years ago, and they weren't white. They were re-racially categorized, and one day they could become black again, as I always point out to these groups. All right, so we need to talk about Sephardic Jews, of which I am one, and these would be Jews from Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Spain, Turkey, you name it. We could go around the horn. And we need to speak about a term, you'll have to read our book, Black Judaism, capital B, capital J. That is extraordinarily complex and extraordinarily interesting and extraordinarily diverse. So I absolutely agree with you. What we do, I think Terrence and I have done this, right? I'm noticing people saying white Jews a lot more since the publication of our book. I don't remember people making that distinction. So I think the book has had that kind of ripple effect that people are very careful in how they refer to Jews. So we can get into a very, very, very deep discussion. There are people more qualified than ourselves to tell you about the multicultural spectrum of Judaism, right? Judaism kind of looks one way in the United States for the most part, but trust me, if you study Judaism, if you go to Israel, if you travel the world, you will understand that Judaism is this huge and capacious thing, and it has no phenotype. It looks like everyone, all right? That's really, really important.
And unfortunately, like with the early sort of black sort of Jewish organizations like the Commandment Keepers, late 1800s, out of New York, but also they were in, I believe, Kansas or Missouri, right? They were kind of considered as protest religions, in part because while they practiced Judaism, they also had an element of black Christian church that people found a bit repulsive. And so the whole idea of allowing them into what we would call mainstream, quote-unquote, Judaism was really difficult, right? Because they were seen as a sect and often marginalized. And then you have other African Americans, right, who again, I hate this term, so I apologize, this idea that, they had a mother or father who were Jewish. And for years, again, they were just biracial or black. And we never really dealt with the Jewish aspect for all kinds of reasons, often because, as Michael McBride writes, in his memoir, The Color of Water, I believe, Color of Water, right, they were alienated. I mean, like, particularly white Jewish women who married black men often were alienated from their families. And so they then would raise their children often in black churches so that they would have a community. So it's a very complicated relationship. And clearly there are black Jews within SNCC, but again, they're not as vocal. Julius Lester is one who's clearly had an illustrious career, and a number of other people, but again, they haven't been as prominent. So we're working, our next project will actually really try to tease that out in more meaningful ways.
Just so we estimate there are more than 500,000 Jews of color in the United States, probably more, right? So these numbers are not small, and they're not inconsiderable at all. In our book, we argue that maybe this grand alliance, this relationship that is broken down, maybe it needs the mediation of Afro-Jews. So we asked Professor Yvonne Shiro, it was kind of a funny question. She's at Swarthmore?
Yeah,
or?
Swarthmore.
So funny. I said, Professor Shiro, are we instrumentalizing Afro-Jews? And I love her answer in the book. She said, you are, and it's good, right? Because they have a really positive role to play in this conversation, and I'm noticing the Jewish federations are listening, all right? I am noticing that they are trying to be far more welcoming of Afro-Jewish communities and Afro-Jewish members within their own synagogues. This could be a very, very positive development. And on the Israel-Palestine issue, I feel there's a role for Afro-Jews between all these aggrieved and irate and upset communities. I believe Afro-Jews have a very, very unique role to play there.
Another question from the audience. Do Puerto Ricans come up in your course? They have had intense relations in the United States with Jews and African Americans in northern cities and social justice movements.
Not as much. I mean, generally Latinos come up in our course, but the minority group that keeps coming up are Asian Americans, right? That's what we find most interesting. So we have all sorts of students. It's the Asian American students that always corner us after class, and they're like, this is mind-blowing, right? Why? Because they feel the model minority trope when they read about Jewish Americans, right? And they feel the physical stigmatization when they read about African Americans. So they sympathize with both communities, right? They see aspects of their own experience in the United States. In terms of Latinos,
no, it hasn't come up at all, really. I mean, very rarely, if at all, yeah. We certainly don't write about it.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question from the audience is, I'm desperately interested in the question on the front of your book. Why aren't blacks and Jews united in their efforts to combat white supremacy?
Look, I would say there are efforts around the country based on this book. We've met a lot of groups, right, that are doing some really fascinating projects. And they're just not getting any kind of attention. And so what we're trying to do is really promote, not simply dialogue, but promote very pragmatic efforts to deal with localized problems, right? Clearly housing is a big issue, right? We're also helping folks think through in terms of how do you think about nonprofit work in your communities? And so I do think there are localized efforts. We can name groups in Cincinnati, in Atlanta, in DC, out in California, Santa Barbara area. But I don't want to make the blanket statement that we're not united, but I think now there's a cautious kind of optimism to work at the local level before thinking about, say, NACP and ADL forming some partnership.
Sure, and so maybe my first and only controversial statement of the evening, and Terrence and I are like the unparalleled masters of controversial statements in our classroom, and the students have learned to accept that. I do have a criticism of the white Jewish American community. I feel it lingers on anti-Semitic comments or things that are said sort of accidentally, which may be pronounced by somebody like LeBron James or Whoopi Goldberg, and I feel clearly nothing malign is meant by these comments, and they're not looking at this frightening behemoth that is white supremacy, right? So my one criticism of the community to which I belong and feel very proud of is they tend to get distracted by comments which aren't particularly nice or maybe could have been said a little bit better, but are really irrelevant because it's very clear to me what the present danger is right now in the United States. So that's my one criticism. You can come at me in the after chat, right? But this obsession with the squad and this obsession even with Minister Farrakhan's rhetoric, I don't like it. I don't condone it. I just don't see it as equivalent to people walking into synagogues with, AK, whatever they're called, right, and shooting folks, right, which we're seeing in African-American churches as well. So that's my one criticism. I feel we have to learn how to prioritize and hierarchize anti-Semitic threats, threat assessment. That's what I would say. I'd like to see better threat assessment in the Jewish American community.
Jocks, you brought up Farrakhan. I was supposed to poke that bear. But there's another question from the audience. And it's funny because this is literally how our steering committee got together talking about black and Jewish relations, because we were talking about this question. How do we respond to someone with great influence, Kanye, or Kyrie Irving, who is polarizing our communities?
I would say, unfortunately, because we don't really examine black communities, we assume that people like Ye or Kyrie Irving have oversized sort of influence, and maybe it's because I'm just getting old and I don't see it. But when I go to black churches, no one is really quoting a Ye or Irving, and in fact, Ye people demonized back in 2017 when it's like, why is this guy thinking about running for president too? Why is he hanging out with Donald Trump? And so, a lot of black women were on Twitter saying this guy is nuts. We have to condemn his behavior. And again, it's kind of like not overly popularized, in part because I think the ways in which black leadership emerges is when you actually criticize like someone in power and who's actually, say, abusing another community. So it's easier, say, to condemn Farrakhan, you get more attention, whereas if you condemn Ye, it's kind of like, it's not really newsworthy or as popular. And with Irving, I think it's very different. I don't know if you saw, we wrote about this, but also there's a news story in the New York Magazine. And what's interesting is that Irving played basketball with an Orthodox Jewish community for like 5 or 6 years. And so when the guy was like, we're like really good friends, I don't appreciate that he tweeted this, but I can assure you he does not hate Jewish people. And I argue that Irving was simply trying to understand an origin story. And then I later found out he has been searching for this idea of how do we think about religion as a kind of groundbreaking way to unite people. So he calls himself some term in terms of where he's not Christian or Jewish or Muslim, but kind of a combination of all three. So it's a really interesting character that I think is an anomaly. And yet, because he has so many followers, people say he has an outdo presence. But I'm not sure people are responding to Ye in the way in which the popular media indicates.
Yeah, so it's exactly what Professor Johnson said. There were running African-American criticisms of Ye, right, prior to the whole DEF CON, whatever that thing was about, right? So it didn't take an anti-Semitic remark by the artist formerly known as Kanye West, right, to have the African-American community being very, very critical of this figure. Same with Dave Chappelle, who I also write about, right, before he did his SNL, his ill-advised SNL monologue on the Jews. There was considerable anger within the African-American community on Twitter about his remarks about LGBTQ folks in particular. So I think it's incorrect to assume that these comments are made and African America hasn't noticed it before they're actually made, right? So I think that was Terrence's point. Terrence had another great point, which I think was lifted, which was boosted from him, about Kyrie Irving searching for origins in a sort of sweet and sad way. And his search for origins took him to Judaism. Didn't take him to Mormonism, right? Took him to Judaism. I would say, the optimist in me, that's a possibility for a conversation, right? If he is thinking in terms of his origin story and looking to Judaism, there are ways we can start talking about that, right? There are ways both communities can come together and say, let's talk about possible common Jewish heritage. And I remember in graduate school studying Semitic languages. I remember Joseph Greenberg and Afro-Asiatic linguistic hypothesis, right? Remember that? I mean, you have to be like a real nerd to know about that. But I remember theories about Semitic languages and African languages and common words and communities in Niger and Nigeria.
Igbo community in Nigeria.
Yeah. So it's there for scholars and for interested folks to look into. Did we get to your question? We went everywhere on that one. I don't know if we... Right.
I'm going to ask a follow-up.
Okay, please.
You mentioned... Oh, did you have something? Oh,
no.
You mentioned the impact of Kanye's communication or the effect of the communication in the black community, and I'm wondering, do you feel that his statements embolden white supremacists? And if so, is that dangerous, and
yes.
how do we respond to that?
And I think what Terrence was saying is the African-American community was noticing, emboldening white supremacists in 2017 and 2018, and they were very vocally saying, what are you doing? And the major media wasn't noticing it. Did I get you right, Terrence?
Yeah, no. I mean, completely ignored their criticisms. I mean, to the point where, like, no, you are costing us an election. And anyway, so yeah, it was very frustrating.
Okay. Can you speak to the intersection of queerness with Jewish and African American relations? I've noticed black and Jewish experiences play a huge role in queer history.
I'll say this. Terrence and I develop a line of inquiry in our work about affinity groups, right? What is the next step for black Jewish? And I use that in quotes, and I hope you understand why I always put that in quotes now, because it's not an accurate term, right? What is the next step in black Jewish relations? I think it's for folks from these communities that have something in common to talk. And what we notice, I want to check if you notice it as well, like we will notice in our classes that LGBTQ students in both communities have been talking for years. They know one another, right? They didn't need our class to start speaking, right? And having this other identity leads them to very, very different types of conversation. So we use the term affinity groups. I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, and
what do you say?
I would use the word that's, again, trigger warning, intersectionality, right? Because a lot of the LGBTQ plus communities were using intersectionality as a way, right, to find not necessarily common ground, but common discourse, right? And discourse through which they could actually engage their multiplicity of identities, but also traumas that they've faced.
Next audience question is, the basic premise of Zionism is that Jews deserve or need a place where they are safe. Why? No one else has that globally, arguably least of all black Americans.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that people like Du Bois, when they wrote about Ethiopianism, which is tied to, and a guy named Blyden wrote about, sort of the Jewish question and the Jewish problem, they imagine Zionism as sort of, a kind of rubric for imagining what would it look like to live in a land where you are safe and free. And I think all, quote-unquote, tribal peoples around the globe want a safe and free place to live. And for Du Bois in particular, is this whole idea of saying, look, we want safety in part because we live in a place where we're not safe. So it wasn't as if, Zionism emerges because we are the, say, triumphant people, we are the chosen. It emerges out of an ongoing kind of threat. And for African Americans who are reading Zionism, right, they are reading Herzl and others as a way that, interesting enough, takes them back to the Old Testament Bible to look at this idea that kings and queens shall emerge forth from Ethiopia. And so Ethiopia becomes a kind of site, imaginary site for thinking about a homeland and thinking about safety. And again, not because they're predestined per se, at least for African Americans, but because of the ongoing sense of violence and threat. And wanting them to reimagine what would it look like then if we were to actually have a place where we could live free from violence.
And I would say homeland, unfortunately, is necessary. Well, I'm not sure I agree with the fundamental premises of the question. For some groups, homeland is necessary for their physical safety. I think it's clear, just speaking to my grandparents and my parents, that Jews are safer because the state of Israel exists. This doesn't preclude many Jews in the United States from having significant criticisms of the state of Israel. And the criticisms are getting sharper and sharper. What I found interesting on this project was reading Du Bois, reading Blyden. There were a couple of other figures. It was Booker T. Washington. It was Marcus Garvey. It was Marcus Garvey, who are like, the Jews are onto something here. All right, we need a safe space also. So there's a kind of understanding in both communities that they are on the receiving end of white Western Christendom's worst impulses, and they need a refuge. They need a shelter. And you could read the Stokely Carmichael break as a moment and say, oh, you know, the white Jews got theirs, but we didn't get ours, and we need ours right now, right? And justifiably so, given the history of racism in this country.
And here's the question that we kind of grapple with in the book, right? Is like, so given this particular moment where we're dealing with cosmopolitanism, dealing with climate change, right? The degree to which borders are being contested all over the world, right? To what extent then is homeland, right, simply, right, a leftover from a world in which we're no longer facing? And this whole idea, if we are, again, trigger warning, I'm just raising it as a theoretical thought, this whole notion of, in light of how people are being forced out of their lands, right? How do we hold on to the history of recognizing ongoing threats to both communities, and yet how do we sit with the very possibility of imagining borderless lands, in part because it's the only way for our survival?
You're really onto something. Just go one step further. Continue. So just redirect it. I think I see it. So you're saying we're living in a world of borderlessness in a variety of ways. Ergo,
the question, the notion of, do we need a state for African Americans, a state for Palestinians, a state for Jews, in light of a very different world that we live in than, say, 100 years ago?
Can I ask, or do we need it more?
That's the one thing I would say. Do we, at this present moment, need it even more? Interesting. I read a lot about Liberia. Liberia fascinates me, right? So there are all of these really kind of grand experiments, and I would put Israel in the same category, to create a physical space where you're safe, right? Where people aren't trying to kill you. But the experiments don't always go perfectly, right? That's what we...
And people still feel very, very threatened, right? And does more force guarantee safety, or is it more a psychological safety? That's, I just don't know.
So are you saying maybe it's an illusion that having your own safe space creates safety? Is that what you're getting?
I don't know. It's a question I want to grapple with.
Or does it create less safety for others, right?
Yeah.
I gotcha. See how we worked that out, right?
I think we're getting to time, so I'm going to ask one question, use moderator privilege, and then we'll see if I have time for more audience. We call this program Bridging the Divide, but to me, part of the message of the book is that this lengthy and fractious history may not be one that leads to bridging unless each side changes its perspective on history and current events in some ways. Is it necessary in interpersonal relations between Jews and blacks to alter a worldview in order for the relationships to succeed, or is this more applicable to relationships between groups and organizations?
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I would say we need our organizations structurally to rethink, right, what are our goals and strategies, and we also need individuals to begin to rethink, like, certain starting points. But here's what I think is really interesting. And again, I'm not trying to sound hokey or anything, but the fact that you guys are here says there's some interest. Right? I mean, thankfully, people didn't come to fight. Thankfully, no one's pulled out a knife to say, okay, I'm tired of you people dissing me, quote unquote. And so I feel like there's a lot of promise here. I think the issue becomes how we think about arguments, how we think about our claims. Are we willing to say, okay, maybe what I believe now won't be true in 60 years? That's what one ethicist named Jeff Stout said in one of his books called Democracy and Tradition. And what if we were to engage not only our histories, right, but engage debates recognizing that 50 years ago, no one talked about trans identity. We were aware of a trans identity. We didn't call it that. We were aware, right, of these communities, and in many respects, they're often protected, right? There are huge trans communities in black churches back in the 50s and 60s, right? And yet, we didn't have the language to articulate it, and now we do. So the question is, given how we're forced to take on new vocabularies, right? I think this is a moment for us to think about, are there new strategies, right? And part of the strategy is, what are we willing to give up? If we claim we want to have some kind of dialogue, if we claim we have mutual interest, what do we give up in the conversation? What do we give up in terms of our political platform, right? Like, for example, I love the comment you told me after Trump was elected, a number of your Jewish colleagues said they called their rabbis to have a conversation, which spoke to that, okay, this was, again, for some people, like, there's no way I'm going to work for Trump, but the fact that you have to go through this kind of deliberation speaks to the very complicated nature. And I'm wondering, if we can do it on that level, why can't we do it in other areas of our lives, right? This idea that we seek authority, we seek text as a way to say, look, I know there's something wrong about this, but yet there's potentially something good here. How do you reconcile that? I think you reconcile it through a constant deliberation, which we always do. It's just that often we end up where we started from, because that's just the easiest point of reference. Like, your origin story is always what's comfortable.
You're reminding me of the story. So very quickly, the story was 3 days before the election in 2016, Washington, D.C., we're Washingtonians. My rabbi got a call saying Donald J. Trump is going to win the election, to which my rabbi was smirking. Will you be willing to accept members from his administration who are Jewish into the synagogue? And I was telling Terrence this story. I want to know why 3 days before the rabbi, I've always wondered, what was that all about, right? Very weird. And nobody took the query seriously because nobody thought it could possibly be the case. And it's a Reform synagogue, so it didn't work out anyhow, right? So when, so I guess I'll end with this. There's kind of this level of friendship, and I really think Americans have to look at their friendships. Like your friends are your friends, right? There's family, family's great, right? And there's friendship. And I'm blessed that I have a lot of friends from different communities. I have a lot of friends who are African-American, non-Jewish. I have Jewish African-American friends. This is what's weird, though. We never talk about this. Isn't that weird? Right? Like, talk about the stupidest things, right? We talk about, I don't know why that is, and I'm not trying to say we've created a post-racial space, because I know how dangerous that phrase is. It's just something I've noticed about my friends and I when we hang out. We're just sort of oblivious to it. And that I know that's true. But I know sociologically that's not true. You cannot be oblivious to race. You cannot be oblivious to class. You cannot be oblivious to homophobia. So I'm just leaving you with that tension that I notice in my own life. I find it very, very odd, right? That with my closest friends, we're just buds, and these issues really don't come up. And I've checked them. I'm like, do we ever? And they're like, no, we never talk about that. It's not important to our friendship. But we know it's really, really important in the larger structural context of the United States. These are real issues, and they're real, and they impact people. I have no answer for that paradox. It might be dealt with better through literature than through sociology. It's just something that I've experienced.
We've had a tremendous discussion tonight. We've talked about a lot of difficult issues. There was many questions from the audience and from us as moderators that we did not get to. I have one final question from myself, and I'm going to give my colleague Jill the last question. But the question that I have for myself after sitting here for nearly 2 hours and having these difficult discussions and it not devolving into yelling and screaming and anger, does it give you hope? Not just hope for the Black and Jewish relationship, but does it give you hope that these conversations can go on with other aggrieved communities that are feeling pain, like the Palestinians?
Yeah, so Terrence, you're going to get the last words. I'm going to say this. Terrence was laughing. Terrence is in the church, and I quoted a line from Scripture, "Even so, come Lord Jesus." And you just started laughing, right? Is that the last line of Revelation? Even so, come Lord Jesus. And there's an optimism in the African-American church, which I love, right? Even so, come Lord. I read it like everything is miserable. We're in this seculum. The world's coming apart. Even so, please come, right? So we must maintain that optimism, right? And we must maintain that optimism not just as blacks and Jews, in quotes, but towards everyone. If not, it's like what James Baldwin, I remember what James Baldwin said about, a world without beauty and a world without art. we have to believe. If we stop believing, we'll never be able to recognize things that are beautiful and people that are beautiful. So I do have a sense of optimism. I do think this can be done. I think 97% of us, 98% of us are fundamentally good, decent people that want to live with one another. And there is that 2 or 3%, which I've always wondered about, and is much more interesting, quite frankly, right? Just thinking about them. But yes, I'm deeply optimistic, even though I shouldn't be. There, how's that? Deeply optimistic, though I shouldn't be.
And I would say I'm not sure I'm deeply optimistic, but I do believe in what Du Bois taught, this idea of divine justice. I do believe that as people question and push back, that justice will emerge. And that's where I place, I guess, my faith. I mean, I place my faith in my students who ask questions, and my faith in people who come out to these kinds of talks. And my job is to simply keep making us feel uncomfortable, to keep reading, to hold myself accountable and my community accountable, and and just have faith, right? And faith in what is not present.
So Langston said that I should ask the last question, and I've been sitting here thinking, what's that last question going to be? But you just said to keep reading. So let me just ask you both for a couple of suggestions for things that people might want to read.
I'm going to do fiction. I'm just going to do fiction because I also teach literature. So Chester Himes' The Lonely Crusade, a great black Jew. Hey, all right. Chester, what a beautiful novel that is. Some beautiful stories by Bernard Malamud. I think his heart was in the right place. They might read a little bit. There's Angel Levine, which is a little bit complicated, right? And I believe he wrote one called Black is My Favorite Color, which I find really, really quite beautiful. And the greatest of all is Paul Beatty wrote a novel called Tough, which is going to shock you from page 1. Paul Beatty won the Man Booker Prize for The Sellout. He's probably America's greatest writer, if you ask me. You will not stop laughing, and you'll be like, I can't believe these guys teach this on an American college campus. It is so scandalous. So those are my 3 fictional recommendations for you.
Let's see. I'd recommend James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, which is incredible. I'd also recommend Claiborne Carson's SNCC, I think The Awakening of America. Oh, yeah.
You got to get women.
Oh, no, yeah. And then I would also, let's see. We often use Beloved, Toni Morrison's Beloved, but also I would think about Alice Walker's collections of essays. I'm drawing a blank on the name.
Her daughter.
Oh, yeah, no, Rebecca Walker's.
Rebecca Walker's daughter. What is the name of that?
Oh, shoot.
Gosh.
Black, White, and Jewish. Thank you.
Fascinating, fascinating work. We've got a scholar in the back.
Thank you both so much. I don't know if our organizers had anything they wanted to say to wrap tonight.
It's a good one.
There's still copies if you would like to buy one of their books. I want to thank you all very much for coming out this evening and participating in this program, which has been so enlightening. Thank you so much to our speakers, Dr. Terrence Johnson and Jacques Berlinblau. Thank you so much. And we've had 2 wonderful moderators, Jill Paperno and Langston Fadden. I have the pleasure of thanking everybody. I want to also thank Karen Alam, Executive Director of the Levine Center to End Hate, for doing an amazing job organizing this. And also my colleague, Dr. Wayne Hilson, who had to leave a little bit earlier. Also, thank you to our ASL interpreters who have been working so hard. This event would not have been possible without the generous support of the Levine Center to End Hate and the William and Mildred Levine Foundation. And special thank you to the foundation president, Todd Levine. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge the support of Howard Konar and the Konar Foundation, as well as Nazareth College. Tomorrow morning, all of you will be receiving a brief survey about tonight, We would really appreciate it if you could fill this out and return it to us. It will just help us make our programs all the better. For attorneys who are seeking these CLEs, please make sure that you fill out the evaluation, and we will be in touch with you tomorrow about how to get the credit. In the coming months, the Levine Center will be offering programs to deepen the conversation that we began tonight on Black-Jewish relations. If you're interested in participating, please contact them at info@endhateroc.org. And the Konar Center will also be hosting a special program on April 18th. Everybody has a flyer on their table. Please take it. It is going to be about a woman, Bettina Aptheker, is coming to speak. She's been an activist for over 60 years and is going to be addressing anti-Semitism and racism. Please, thank you so much for coming tonight, and I hope you all drive home safely.